Looks like our numbers are evening out here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I just want to give a big thank you for being part of our webinar today called Transforming Reading Outcomes, Key Considerations for Change and Impact. So as I hope you know, this October is actually Dyslexia Awareness Month. And so we've had a number of things programmatically that we've been trying to kind of do and share with our community through the Windward Institute. I had an opportunity earlier this week to go down to be part of a national lobbying day with the National Center for Learning Disabilities in conjunction with this. And so I got to go down and talk to a number of really wonderful folks across the country. Again, trying to kind of make sure that folks are really aware of the work that's happening in this space. And for us also to make sure that we're sharing some really great work and sharing some really great resources for our community. We have a few things. For those of you who have not had a chance to take a listen on our podcast, the Read podcast with Dr. Danielle Gomez, I would highly recommend you spend a little time with that. We also have a special edition that she and I host together called Lead on Read. And we had a wonderful conversation that we're launching for this month with Kareem Weaver, who's the founder of the Fulcrum Institute. So like really exciting, some really exciting stuff. Great conversation. One of those conversations that leaves you just deeply inspired about the work and thinking about ourselves as change agents. And doing some incredible work. I'd also like to do a quick plug. We do have our fall lecture coming up. We have one of our really incredible researchers here locally named Dr. Katie Pace-Miles, who's going to be talking about transforming literacy education, early identification, interventions, and teacher training. And so I really would, if you can join us for that, please, you can get registered through the WI website. But really excited to have her join us. She's been a great partner for us here locally. She does some incredible work over in Brooklyn with CUNY and a lot of her teachers, kind of rising teachers. So I'm very excited. I actually have two really incredible guests. I have a fun job, so I get to do a lot of really exciting things. Get a chance to do some work out in the community, get a chance to get to know our students well, partner with the WI on thinking about where we're headed. And I could not be happier today to have two really incredible folks with us. First up, we have a former special education instructor, Phil Capin, who's a member of the Windward Institute's advisory board and is an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And his research really focuses on understanding differences in reading development and developing and evaluating the efficacy of instructional practices, primarily for students with language-based learning disabilities. So his current study is focusing on improving narrative language and reading comprehension for elementary, emergent, bilingual students, which is really exciting to hear about. In addition to advancing understanding of reading development instruction, a primary goal of his work is to actually translate research findings in ways that allow us to meaningfully address current challenges that affect educators and students. So this idea of translational science is something that's near and dear to our hearts here at Windward, and we're just really glad to have Phil here today with us to help talk about some of these things. And then another dear friend of mine here, Ruth Genn, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Literacy Academy Collective, also known as LAC, whose mission is really to build and support a network of New York City public schools. Notice I did not say charter, public schools, designed to build and support learning needs and academic achievement for struggling readers. So the LAC's first school, PS 642 in the South Bronx, which is called the South Bronx Literacy Academy, opened in fall of 2024 and is the first district public school in the country. I want to say that again because I think this is such an important and exciting thing. It's the first public school in the country designed to support students with dyslexia. So the LAC also partners with the NYCPS districts and schools to mount structured literacy pilots across the work here, and also provides them in-depth training, mentoring, and coaching in structured literacy. And we have been proud partners of the SBLA for several years now. I've been working on this project with you for this almost my fifth year being on board for this. So just could not be more excited about what the work that you're all doing. But Ruth has over 20 years of leadership and innovation in the NYC education sector and has been a steadfast champion for access and equity for our youngest learners to college-age students. So I am just thrilled to be here with the two of you today. We also had we were supposed to have Lakeisha Johnson, who is down in Florida, but she's sick, and I believe we're all aware of the weather scenario that's been happening in Florida. So we do wish her a speedy recovery. She is the assistant professor in communication science and disorder programs at Florida State University, and she's also the director of the Village. And so there's a great podcast if you want to learn more about her. We interviewed her for Lead on Read, and I would highly recommend you go back and do a little listen to that. She is an amazing human being, and we just wish her a speedy recovery. So we're going to get started. So here's what I thought we would kind of do today. My hope is this can feel really conversational. So I've got some questions. Some will be directed at the two of you. Some will maybe specifically given your space. But I'm really going to encourage you both. Pop in if you've got another insight kind of on top of what's happening on the conversation. Do not feel like you can't, because I think that we all have some great insight here. But we're going to start with this idea that we know that rates in literacy in the U.S. are truly a macro level problem. And as Ruth, as you and I have talked about so many times, there's a civil rights challenge within the context of this as well. And it's not just also limited with students with learning disabilities because they're not receiving the education they need, but based on the nation's report card of education, 42% of New York students actually scored below basic for reading proficiency in 2022. If you are outraged by this as an educator, as someone who loves children, who's someone who wants access to literacy to be at a greater degree, I don't know what's happening in your life if that doesn't outrage you. But the idea of having, working to kind of have some meaningful and lasting change in literacy outcomes really involves a lot of folks kind of coming to the table at both the district and state and national level. So this is for both of you to kind of kick off here, but what do you feel are some really important priorities for local, state, or national policymakers as we think about focusing on this in order to increase access to high quality reading instruction for all students, whether they have dyslexia or just general reading disabilities? Big one out of the gate.
Ruth, do you want me to go first?
Sure, pop in.
Okay. Yeah, well, let me start by saying thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion today. I'm so impressed by the work that Windward School does to serve students with language-based learning disabilities. And then when you layer on the Windward Institute and all the work you're doing to sort of develop leadership and professional learning and partnerships in this space, the impact is tremendous. And so kudos to Windward and to all of us for being here today to participate in this conversation, which I think is really important. When we're thinking about priorities for policymakers, I'm often thinking about the most important thing we can do to improve reading outcomes for students with dyslexia is to prevent them. And so I'm always thinking about early, systematic, and explicit instruction for students that may be at risk for code-based difficulties. And so I think when you're thinking about early interventions, we have to push in on screening, and we have to push in on identifying students that may have some risk in the early grades. Of course, there's been a lot of policy that's happened in our country around reading and over the last, and if you go back further to sort of the foundational work in Mississippi about 10 years ago, but really in the last 5 years, we've had a tremendous amount of policy work. And I think some of the priorities to me, and I'm interested in what Ruth thinks about this and other ideas she has, I think we're at a place where it would be valuable to take stock of, what is working and for whom and under what conditions, because we've passed a lot of legislation. I think a lot of it's really well intentioned around screening, around intervention requirements, and prescribing and proscribing different approaches for reading instruction. And I think a lot of this is well-intentioned. And I think, the challenges around implementation and to what extent are these policies singularly, and then when we look at them in states that have, collection or comprehensive legislation, what kind of impact are we having? And so I think one priority for me is around evaluating, and not just to say like this is working or this is not working. We know it's never that clear, that it's, in which states is this working and under what conditions. There's a really good study that came out in California recently, and it's a comprehensive program where they provided professional learning. They provided schools extra money. They had lots of supports. I mean, this is sort of really state-of-the-art and well-funded work in California to improve literacy outcomes. And the findings are very impressive. But their approach, had reading coaches, it had screening, it had intervention materials. It was comprehensive. And so I think understanding, what's working and for whom. And then maybe there's more I could say, but I'll make two other plugs. I think one other thing, and I think it relates to the issues around equity that I think are really important, is I think we have to think in our policies how we're going to push in on equity-focused policies. We know that reading difficulties, they cross socioeconomic lines, they cross race and ethnicity, but disproportionately, unfortunately, reading difficulties impact students that live in poverty and students that come from Indigenous and African-American communities and Latino communities. And it's possible that some of these disparities were exacerbated by COVID. And so I think we need to think about in our policies how we can provide these under-resourced communities more resources and really support those students. And then the last thing I'll say is I think, I'm from California originally, and in California, we have In-N-Out Burger, and I miss In-N-Out Burger. I live in Boston now. There's nothing, I think, there's no In-N-Out east of the Mississippi. And what you love about In-N-Out is they have this special sauce. And when I think about like the special sauce for some of these policies, it's around leadership and coaching. And there's pretty strong research to support the idea of reading coaches. And the role of instructional leaders and teacher leaders. And so I think, one thing these policies have not focused on enough in my mind is equity. And another thing they haven't focused enough is supporting instructional leaders.
Couldn't agree more. So thank you. And I've got some follow-ups in there, but I'm going to let Ruth hop in before I pop in.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Jamie. And I was a Windward parent, and it's just been really amazing to work with you in this other way for the past few years and see everything you're doing to try to reach the broader community, and appreciate that so much. I definitely agree, Phil, on what you were saying around the type of research. And, a couple of years ago, I was working on like bringing high impact evidence-based tutoring to New York City. And the research was like, well, this program works. So like, let's just get, high school students to do it. And it was like, well, no, that program works because it had trained teachers with this type of coaching. So it's not just the program, but it's what are all of the elements that had to be in place to make that intervention work. So I just wanted to like totally say I agree with that. And I'm so glad you brought it up. I'm going to zoom in on one policy issue because it is top of mind right now for us at LAC, and that is educator preparation programs and teaching teachers how to teach reading. And just to back up a little bit and like sort of how we LAC got to that issue being top of mind, as Jamie was saying, we created the first in-district public school for teachers to serve students with dyslexia and other struggling readers. That school opened a couple of years ago, South Bronx Literacy Academy. And in essence, we've created our own teacher training model in, close collaboration with the Windward School, where we're bringing Windward courses to our students, to our teachers as students, and providing a practicum model to really do a deep training for all of our teachers before they step foot in our classroom. And so we've had lots of teachers come through our training the past few years, and just seeing the impact that training makes, not just on the student outcomes, but on our teachers' self-efficacy. I mean, we've had teachers come through our training program who are longtime, special ed teachers in the public school system who have said like, wow, I don't think I've ever, learned to teach a skill before. And these are teachers who are coming out of educator preparation programs and basically being retrained, and in our program, again, in partnership with Windward. And I think there is really a moment of reckoning to be had around educator prep programs, and New York State is having that moment of reckoning, which I'm just so incredibly excited about. We sort of realized we couldn't impact the teachers as broadly as necessary as one small organization. And in the past year, we've been lucky enough to work in partnership with New York State leaders to become part of something called the Path Forward, which is like a national policy movement around bringing more science of reading into educator preparation programs. There's like a lot of momentum around literacy in New York State the past couple of years. But by really like zeroing in on this issue, the path forward let us bring together leaders from across, New York State, including the chancellors of education, the commissioners, the chancellors of our higher education system, deans, faculty, professors, to really, reckon with this question of how can we ensure that our educator prep programs are really grounding their faculty, their courses, their syllabi in the science of reading and in the latest research, as we do in so many other disciplines, right? We ensure that our graduate schools are incorporating everything we know about the discipline. So I'm happy to share more about where New York State is. Yesterday, we released a statewide action plan of how New York State is planning to address this, both at the policy level and at the practitioner level. And I would love to talk more about that. But I just think there's a tremendous opportunity and a real moment of leadership in New York to tackle this. And so much time spent, I know, at Windward and across the district and sort of retraining teachers and bringing needed training to teachers. So I'm really excited about trying to address that at the core.
Yeah. So I think the two of you actually talked to kind of hit on a few things that I just want to kind of really kind of echo back a little bit and kind of amplify. One, Phil, I so appreciate your statement of, what's working for whom under what conditions.
Yeah.
And so that's really where I think this idea of fidelity of program in so many places, as you talked about, Ruth, like it's not just dropping in the box, right, to solve the problem. It's really, I think that, as Phil talked about too, and as you've pointed out, there's a holistic, systemic sort of side of this. You have to have good instructional materials. You have to have really deep and detailed supportive training. And what does that training look like, right? The idea of pulling in some coaching work, the idea of thinking about the translational side of this. I know you're up at Harvard now, and I had done a summer program, Phil, with Bob Brooks, who's a great psychologist up there, talking about resilience. But I always loved the way Bob has sort of framed out this: what are you going to do and say when you're in front of kids on Tuesday? Like, hearing him say that over and over again has always stuck with me as we're talking about research. And so sometimes what can really be such an intense scientific focus, which is really what we need to kind of understand some of the big questions and where the patterns are, the data, and where the truth is, if so to speak, in some of these kind of paths forward here. But really, at the end of the day, how do you help translate that to the person who's going to be sitting in front of that second grade kid in a classroom, right? Because I can hand her a stack of research articles and she can say, oh, that's all really interesting. But what does it look and feel like when I'm in front of kids? And how do I do that in a way that sort of promotes some fidelity of what they were trying to accomplish in that? And also recognizing, in any given study, there's a set of conditions that this was given in and a way that this worked when it was sort of researched. And if you're not matching up with that in a lot of ways, you can really have some misses. So I think understanding for whom did it work and under what conditions did it work is it's a core kind of quintessential question as you're thinking about, looking at how do you implement some of this work in the classroom. And so, but I just really, and also, Ruth, I want to just kind of echo the teacher training side of this. This is my, I think, 22nd year in education. This is 16, 17 years of interviewing teachers. And, folks come to schools like ours, honestly, typically not knowing all they need to know to be successful in front of kids. Because I think people come out of really good master's programs and undergraduate programs for teacher prep, but they haven't actually taught folks how to teach reading just yet. And so often I think the idea is they kick the can down the road and they're hoping, and I'm like big sort of fingers crossed here, that by the time they get into a classroom, some district's going to give them the materials, the box, and some districts are going to train them to an incredible degree. And some districts are going to provide coaching and support for them to be successful in the space. I think the three of us know from deep experience that those things are rarely there. There's often no great materials given to teachers. There's often so little support and coaching in the process of that. And there's really also no deep training. It's maybe take an hour, read the manual, let me know if you have questions. And if you're expecting good outcomes on a shaky foundation, I would argue you're probably kidding yourself, right? And I think that some of the national data would support that work. But But as you think about, this idea of wanting to get to a space where teachers are trained to an incredible, much higher degree, that they have the materials, instructional materials that they need, they have the coaching support that they need, as Phil had talked about in the California study. What are some barriers that you two see in us getting to that space, to where those teachers sitting in front of kids on a Tuesday morning has what he or she needs to deliver the program in a way that's going to be positive for kids?
Yeah, I mean, to take it to the next step in the process, right? I mean, there's the educator preparation piece, and then yes, there is sort of the conditions that are the reality for our teachers day to day working in our schools. And I
Mm-hmm.
will tell you something like we are really struggling with is time and the constraint of time, and especially working within the district system. And there are,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of regulations and around how teachers can use their time, how much time they have. And it's proving to be a real challenge. We're not set up to have an apprentice year for our teachers
Mm-hmm.
before they come teach in our scale play classroom. So how can we sort of try to create the conditions of apprenticeship within our schools, or within some kind of bounded training program that can fit into the time we have? Um, I'd say that is our number one issue. And even once our teachers are in, right, like they have 44 minutes on a Monday afternoon. So really getting the in-depth coaching that you're both talking about is a real challenge of the district system. Not for lack of desire by anybody in the district. It's just the sort of the constraints of the structure of the day. I mean, what we've done is taken that training and done a summer practicum, because that is, there's flexible time. Now that's
Yeah.
outside of, you have teachers typical contract hours. That's a summer program. We do it in partnership with the district. They've been terrific partners in terms of helping us set that up as part of the summer school program. So we're using basically summer school as a time to do deep training with teachers, have our teachers teaching students in front of students. So students are getting, programs delivered to them directly. And then our teachers, because it's summer and there's a little bit more flexibility, are getting 2 hours a day of coaching and feedback. It's a low stake setting. They're getting really day-to-day feedback on what they're going to do the very next day, as you're saying, in front of their class the very next day. That low stakes setting and that kind of practicum setting we have found to be invaluable, but we have not figured out how to replicate that during the school day, because once, September 7th hits, like you're in front of that class.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that is by far our greatest challenge. And, we're sort of muddling through, can we do something different in partnerships with universities and partnerships with training programs? How can we sort of capitalize on the structures that are out there to ensure that adults can keep learning, because they don't currently exist within the school system? So I'd say that is our greatest challenge in terms of taking what we know and translating it to teachers.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'm yet to meet a teacher who, when you help them to see maybe a better way to do something, that they're not eager to adopt it. I mean, teachers are, when they know how to do better, they do better. And I think researchers, many of them are the same way. But unfortunately, the match between researchers and teachers is often off. Oftentimes
Yeah.
researchers are developing studies that are not addressing the problems of practice that teachers are really facing. There's, I could go on in these sort of incentive structures within universities,
Mm-hmm.
but we're incentivized to publish in peer-reviewed journals that will unfortunately be unaffordable to teachers usually.
Yeah.
We're incentivized to get grants to study novel practices, when really we actually, like particularly in early reading, we have a lot of knowledge about what supports early reading development. The problem is less about knowing what to teach, but how do we develop implementation science and implementation practices that will get those practices in front of schools, given all of the constraints we have in public education. And so there are some systems that are off. And I think for me, the way in which we could start to do better is to make sure that we're forming strong research to practice partnerships. And so when I'm thinking about like, what am I going to study for the next 5 years, it's coming less from my office and coming more from schools and hearing what are the challenges you're facing in your schools. how could I help you to address those, and grounding it in practice, and then working in partnership with teachers to develop instructional materials that will be feasible and effective for teachers, that they'll be excited to use, that students are going to be excited to engage with, and then to study, some of the implementation science around these practices. And so I think, it's a very difficult challenge, and unfortunately our systems, the incentive structures and the systems are not set up well for these kinds of partnerships. But at least a couple agencies are recognizing that this is an issue and supporting research to practice partnerships. And so, it's on people like me to really dig in and learn from teachers.
Yeah, and I so appreciate, Phil, I want to just kind of take a moment and a pause here to kind of really highlight something you said early in your side of this, is that teachers have a desire to do better for kids. And I completely agree with you. I've never met a teacher in my life who did not want to serve the children that are in front of them. And I do think when folks know a little bit better, they do a little bit better. It almost reminds me of a bit of a conundrum that we see with our kids coming in, right? So often they've gone through an educational system that did not meet their needs, did not provide the services, did not provide the intervention that the kids need to really understand and crack the code and have a greater command of literacy. And they internalize this as their fault, right? I couldn't. And sometimes I worry that in the conversation that we have around teachers, that folks can feel a little bit like that. Well, it's my fault. I didn't. And I want to just say, I don't think it's teachers' fault. I think it's actually university training programs' fault. I think there's there has to be a lot of onus placed on universities for doing that. I also think that districts and curriculum folks within districts have a far greater responsibility to select stronger programs and solve the problem, Ruth, as you pointed out, time, right? I think that like at a school like Windward, you can see where our priorities are by looking at our schedule, right? Like you can. So we spend 2.5 hours a day focused on literacy instruction and pulling the writing process into that language arts work, because we know that is a deeply meaningful and impactful thing for kids. And I do think when it comes to school districts, and there's everything's a priority, so therefore nothing becomes a priority. And if you can't get this priority right, all the other stuff becomes a far heavier lift in the work. So I think we have to help, some district folks, and I think some university folks think about what they're pushing into those systems a little bit more readily. And I also appreciate the ownership on kind of research and finding ways to kind of actually sort of create that bridge. I remember having several conversations with Don Compton about this when we met, Phil, down in South Africa. I remember having a few late night conversations with Don about this is a system that has incentivized itself to feed itself, right? And so how do we sort of break that in order to be able to allow more funding to flow in a way that allows this work, the translation side of this, to be more, just to be more kind of recognized as a meaningful side of the science? Because sometimes I feel like it's the thing that's sort of like thought about way after the fact, and then we have to find ways to kind of create those bridges. And I think it would be more efficient and effective if we had some clear bridges that were built to help disseminate this work to the people who are actually on the ground doing some great work with kids. I want to shift gears a little bit here. We talked a little bit about the concept of this being a social justice issue in so many ways. I have been one to rail on the NAEP data for quite some time. It's one of those things when you take a step back from any given year, and you look at the patterns that have kind of been sort of laid out there over the last 20, 30 years and on the NAEP, you see some real clear patterns. One is that the number of students who are below basic has actually gone up since the last report. So we're actually serving kids less well on the whole. And when you look at that sort of that larger time horizon, we have not moved the needle for kids in literacy in this country. And I think it just breaks my heart that we've not been able to do that. But then when you start to disaggregate that data just a little bit more and start to look at some subgroups within there, When you look at Black and Brown students who on average scored 29 points lower than their white counterparts, Hispanic students scored 17 points lower than their white counterparts. And then of those who are certainly, and many of those who are eligible for free and reduced lunches. But when you look at the free and reduced lunch ban, an average of 28 points lower than those who are not eligible. So there is certainly some economic impact within this. There are some, I think, some issues within how we're looking and sort of serving students in Black and Brown communities. And the idea of these historically underserved and marginalized communities is just so well documented. So as we think about, and I get so inspired by the work that you have been doing, Ruth, in terms of like, let's take the New York City DOE to task on this. Let's push hard on a big, cumbersome system that in order to be able to reach more kids. But, when we think about some of the ways that we might be able to look at kind of early identification in any system that we're talking about to kind of help reach students, and particularly those students in marginalized communities, Black and Brown kids, socioeconomic disadvantaged students. What are some of the most promising ways right now that you've seen for us to kind of go in and start to identify the challenges and recognize where kids may need some additional help?
Yeah. I mean, my team talks a lot about this and sort of the issue of early identification and how closely linked it is or must be to the issue of teachers knowing what to do with that data. And I think that has been a really big barrier to early identification. One that makes sense in a way. I think it's quite hard as an educator to say, your child can't read and I don't know what to do about it. Sorry. And so I think that has prevented us. I mean, I know that has prevented us systemically at a policy level from sharing what we do know about how to identify children early. So I'd say that is one real barrier that we need to think about. How do we, until we arm teachers, schools, educators, leaders with the information to address that early identification, we're not going to get that far with early identification. And the truth is, maybe we shouldn't, right? Because then we're bringing a problem, we're not bringing a solution. It's got to be linked, and that link, that missing link, I'm sorry, I feel like has led to a lot of mistrust around early identification. So often, like when families come to SBLA, we are often the first one to tell those teachers, those families, your child is not reading. Oftentimes families come to us and say, oh, the school said, they're doing fine. They're a little bit of a late bloomer. It's okay. They're only in second grade. They'll catch on later. I see my child flipping through books every day. We are often the bearers of that news, that actually your child is at the 4th percentile, is at the 7th percentile, and really talking with parents about what that means. So I'd say that's another piece. It's like giving our teachers and our schools the language to have those conversations with families about what does that mean? And what am I going to do to address it and to remove the piece that I think has historically been there when we talk about equity, and this is a civil rights issue around, your child can't read. What are you doing about it, parent? How come you're not reading? And that's been a real challenge for the families that we serve, feeling like there's a dynamic of blame, there's a dynamic of it's your fault, and what's missing is that piece of, and here's how I'm going to help you. So I think for, I guess, that early identification piece needs to go hand in hand. I mean, New York City has been doing some really good work around trying to bring universal, not quite screeners, but, really to assess students more consistently in a way that might point out. But I think what's missing, right, that might point out reading deficiencies for students, but what's missing is the language and the skills for teachers to then say, okay, so now what's next? And until we get to that piece, I think we're not going to make a lot of progress on the early identification.
Thank you.
I guess the last thing is just to say about that also is, I think especially in many of the communities that we're serving in the South Bronx, families are not looking for a diagnosis, right? Historically, a diagnosis has meant your child is in special ed and they're therefore going to be warehoused in a school that has, no accountability and no no proven success. And so that's been, you know, the families we're serving are not looking as some families in wealthier districts maybe for, you know, help me figure out what's happening with my child so I can get resources. A lot of the families we're serving are saying, I don't want that diagnosis, right? Because historically it's not been used for my community to impact my community in positive ways. So I think that's just another barrier that we need to think about when we're having the conversation around early identification.
Agree.
Yeah.
Agree.
I just want to underscore what you said, that early identification does not matter if you are not providing instruction that's going to address the issues. I mean, there's been a lot of legislation around early screening, and I think it's well intentioned. But oftentimes it's leading to more time spent on screening and assessments and less time on instruction, and or it's not coupled with high quality instruction, as you suggested, Ruth. And I think that's really problematic. I think when we're thinking about early reading, particularly for English learners, students who have the dual task of learning a second language, English as a second language, and developing these content literacy skills. What we see is that the early screening measures function pretty similarly for English learners. So if you give student an oral reading fluency test, how many correct words can you read per minute in grade 1, or a phonemic decoding task in kindergarten or first grade, it is going to identify the students that have difficulties. Now, it's hard to know, though, are they true difficulties? Are they due to maybe, falling on the end of a distribution where they have more risk for disability, like a true underlying neurobiological issue? Or is it that they've had a lack of exposure in English? Maybe they just haven't received, English language instruction, so they don't have the code. Or maybe they have received instruction in English, but that instruction hasn't been focused on the code enough because people have thought, oh, this is an English learner. They just need vocabulary supports. They don't, the code is not going to be the problem. And so I would say that in addition to using those early screeners, and I don't think you need to use a lot of them, I think the best way to be able to parse out for an English learner who there's a lot of things that can influence their presentation on a test. Their prior language experiences, if they're an immigrant, their immigrant experience, the distance between their culture and the taught curriculum. I mean, all these factors come into play and influence their performance on this 60-second measure, right? And so it's hard to parse these things out. I think you start with a screener, you try to err on the side of identifying students and not missing any kids. And then you provide instruction and you use that to index their risk. You provide instruction to them in early reading skills, and then you determine based on their response to instruction, and that's really what we need in these MTSS systems, is their response to instruction to be the decision maker about, whether they get more supports or maybe they need less support. And so I think, Peter always asks me, what are the best measure to use for English learners? What is reliable and valid? And I tell them there's not a good test out there that's going to be perfect for all kids. The best thing you can do is provide high quality instruction, which I think it relates to what Ruth is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I so appreciate the, I think both the points that you two have kind of made here is one is, because I'm currently sitting with some of our friends from Windward on the Governor's Task Force for Dyslexia. And so 3 subgroups, one looking at policy, one looking at instructional practices, and one looking at screening. And I'm happy to be sitting in the screening group, and it's been a fascinating sort of cyclical conversation as we're trying to figure out how to move this conversation forward. What I love is the fact that the entirety of my subgroup so recognizes that, well, we can screen kids, but if we don't have a good foundational literacy program here supporting kids in their development and the work that they're doing, then you're going to get a lot more positives than what you really have. So maybe we focus on, so we're working to get through the process of outlining what a good screener could look like, but also with this heavy emphasis on, like, we have to have good instruction. Otherwise, like, you end up saying everybody's got a broken leg and, and everybody's been identified as having this challenge. And then what do we do with everybody? It kind of clogs the whole system up. So I think kind of going back to some good foundational practices is just key. And I also feel I so appreciate this balance of instruction versus assessment, because I think so many schools get that balance a look because you want to come with the mindset of I want to tackle this problem, and sometimes the problem tackling involves way too much testing and assessment versus instructional time. And I think finding ways to kind of really balance that out for a school district is so incredibly important. And so I want to ask maybe one more question, and then we've got a few questions in the Q&A here that I really would like to be able to kind of address here. And I want to sort of think about, kind of maybe elevating this last question here. And really about, how do we start to build stronger advocacy? Because I'm just thinking about the work that you do, Ruth, and how you have sort of radiated from these concentric circles of community-based and thinking about local, school district-based to city-based, to working on state-based issues. But how do we build stronger advocacy efforts, both at community, state, national levels, in order to be able to start to prioritize literacy and ensure funding for that comprehensive approach that Phil had talked about earlier, that California is trying to tap into, about looking at the screening, the coaching, the instructional practices, the training, and having those things all kind of hum really, really well together. So any kind of thoughts before we dive into some folks' questions on the Q&A here?
Yeah, I wish I could channel my co-founders who are really serious longtime advocates and who I have learned so much from, because that was not my background. I was kind of the institutional education person, and was lucky enough to team up with a group who were deeply embedded in the parent and family community in New York City, and that has been so incredibly powerful for our work. And I've learned just a ton from them about, I'd say, the importance of parent and community voice. You hosted last week, Jamie, at the Dyslexia Task Force hearing. We had 11 families come. I mean, the words of our parents and families are, more than I could ever convey on this webinar, right? To hear from a family who has had their child's life changed by learning to read, like, that is the most powerful thing. That is a voice everybody wants to hear. That is a voice everybody could relate to. And that has just been invaluable to our work, is to have a really strong family and community presence. We started this work 5 years ago just by doing education events, just roundtables for parents. What do you do if your child can't read? Just education events, advocacy events, sort of just getting parents in the sort of space where they could talk about it, think about it, be real about it. Your other families, like that was so important to our work. And that was important as we got to those higher levels of policy. I'd say the second thing is also just seeing the work firsthand has been, I'd say, our most powerful tool. So, before we even had our school, we said, God, we got to get something off the ground. And we did a pilot, with Windward support in East Harlem, a tiny pilot one summer, and we got leaders to come and just see it in action. And you could literally see the light bulbs come off, like, wow, you can teach high poverty communities to read. It was literally like that, Seeing is believing. When you can see practice in the classroom, when you can hear a parent voice, when you can see a child who didn't want to come out on the first day, then begging to let them hear their word list, like that is what has allowed us, honestly, to build coalitions with leaders. It's them talking to our teachers, not hearing from us. So getting that work started, having a place where people can see it and feel it and talk to the people who are connected.
And I remember, Ruth, from that first summer pilot, the debrief, where there was some DOE teachers and some Windward teachers, and we had a DOE teacher ask the question, well, how do you have time for all this?
Yeah.
It was this kind of like the time, it's always time, right? How do you have time for this? Yeah. And I remember one of our teachers said, it's actually less about the time you have and more about how you're using the time that you have been given. So, and I just thought that was a really insightful sort of piece that started bringing that intentionality, that sense of efficacy to the work, to think about, okay, time is a finite resource. Let's accept that for a moment. Whether I would like to have that change is a whole other thing, but time is a finite resource. So how are we using the time that we have to be the most productive for the kids that we're trying to serve in this space, though? But yeah, so I so appreciate all of that. So Phil, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I think I would just echo Ruth's point about raising up the voices of those that are most impacted. I mean, this is a civil rights issue. It is a human rights issue, literacy, is at the core of our identities and our ability to function in society. And, I think these reading wars have persisted, unfortunately, for so long, and it's gotten so ideological. And I think when you expose, the very human elements of this, it seems like that's when the advocacy really hits home with people. I think for myself, I identify mostly as a scientist, and I don't have training in advocacy or know that much about it, but I need to, try to be a part of these discussions because, advocates, we would all want advocates to, to align with the science as best they can. And so, if people like me, say, oh, that's not my job, I'm a scientist, we can't then later say, oh, well, that advocacy effort's misguided, So I think, I and others
It's
could
what you
do
were saying
better.
earlier. You were saying the importance of having researchers in the classrooms and researchers working with the constituents. Like that is such a powerful tool, right? If your work can empower parents to understand how their child is learning to read, then they become better advocates. And so that's really, I didn't get to comment on that earlier when you said that, but I was so happy you said that because that is the missing link, that direct conversation between the people with the information and the people who are our greatest advocates.
Yeah. And I think there's a number of researchers, I'm going to put Phil in this category here, who have that some classroom sort of background, and thoughtfulness and experience, and that desire to translate. Emily Solari, Devin Kearns is another. There's some really, I think there's some exciting things, I think, afoot right now. I think some things that haven't had the clearest path or the clearest direction. I think this idea of translational science, we've been talking about here for a long time. I remember having a wonderful webinar, I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, with Nadine Gabb, Emily Solari, talking about this idea of really bringing that translational science to bear. And we've been focusing on that on a lot of our lectures, because I do think that's really where bringing the research from the lab to the bench, from bench to the bedside model, right? Which I think in the medical field, they have such a much clearer sort of set of circumstances that allow that to happen a little bit more readily. In education, we don't have those foundational kind of channels to help that. Before we get to, I'm going to ask one more question, so forgive me here, but I'm just thinking about if you could sort of summarize from each of your distinct different vantage points here, 2 or 3 things that you think educational leaders in this space should be considering when they're trying to come to the table to really impact outcomes for kids who are struggling from a reading standpoint. What are 2 or 3 things that you really want them to know, understand, do, say? What would you tell them if you had a moment just to kind of do the shoulder shake for a minute and just let them know where they need to be?
I could go first, Ruth, and then you'll have more insightful things to share. I think one thing that I might consider recommending is that if you think about literacy efforts as only the literacy efforts that happen in your schools, your impact might be limited. And I think, Ruth's point about pre-service really resonated with me, and about the importance of, in what other field do we have this, lack of standardization around best practices? People that graduate from medical school, from law school, they come with a set of competencies, and we don't quite have that in education. And I, like you all, put the burden on pre-service. And so I think, how does a school leader impact that? I've been working with Ohio for the last few years, and they have this initiative focused on connecting P to 20. So from preschool all the way to higher ed. And the state is allocating funds to support districts and higher ed to come together around different initiatives, like the high dosage tutoring initiative you did in New York City, Ruth. They were focusing on that. And so it has districts, leaders, and school leaders working directly with higher ed institutions. And I think that, that's helping these higher ed institutions understand the real problems that they're facing, the types of experience they need to provide pre-service teachers. Like, they need more opportunities to be in classrooms with kids as part of their mentorship model. Also, helping, as Ruth talked about earlier, helping families with early literacy, in the home. And not to say that it should be a family's job to educate all students academically. I'm not trying to, put the responsibility on families, but many families are hungry for, ways they can help their kids at home, as at birth, right? And we know literacy starts at birth. And so it's, I think if we can, help to leverage families, that would be one way. And so I think, thinking outside of the campus, and then of course, have to focus on prevention, I think is really key. And maybe the third thing I would say is the leaders that I think lead to sort of sustained change are often instructional leaders. They're people that really understand what good instruction looks like, and they're not afraid to go into a class and teach alongside a teacher, or to coach a teacher, or even to model some instruction. You don't have to be, the reading expert, but they have to have some knowledge if they really want to change the culture, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So agree.
Ditto to all that. Ditto to all that for sure. And you started talking at the end about this culture of learning. And I think that is so counter to what's even the higher ed is all about learning. It's also counter to learning within higher ed, where our teachers are being trained. There's a lot of, I'm the expert and I have a master's in literacy and therefore I'll teach what I've taught. So like, how do we create that culture of learning within higher ed and within our schools too, right? I mean, how do we create spaces where, teachers at the K-12 level and the higher ed level are open to experts coming into their door, to the idea that knowledge is going to empower them, not going to be used to, challenge or, challenge only in a good way. So I think creating that culture of learning is huge. Empowering our teachers with knowledge is the second thing. And how we do that, I think, I think there's been really positive movement in New York around getting closer to what you were saying earlier, Jamie, to the right curriculum, the right materials, to what we know is going to work. But we can't forget to do like the hearts and minds work with our teachers of the why are we doing this and what does it feel like to be impactful in front of your students. And what I wouldn't want to see happen is that we do sort of the technical work and not the work of helping our teachers understand the why. And so then the pendulum swings back and our teachers forget things. So I think taking the time to invest in that deep training and coaching of our teachers to understand the why and how is really important.
And having some recursive nature of that, kind of cycling back and doing some refreshers, because we all can get into a space where like, I remember this so clearly. And then like you do a refresher and you're like, oh, I'd forgotten these three things. And so, and but for both of you, I just want to say how much I appreciate kind of the systemic sort of conversation today, thinking about kind of rising up, elevating a little bit, thinking about the whole, looking at good instructional practices, good screening practices, good coaching practices, good teacher support, things that don't place blame, but actually kind of recognize the problem for what it is and then work to provide some help in that space. Thinking about the families who are hungry for some things here and the importance of that language exposure, just having like good verbal language with children is just so important. I know Mark Seidenberg's had just a number of those conversations about like really thinking about pushing that language out in front. So there's so much here that I think that my hope is that as folks listen to this or are doing some work in the space, that they can start to think about those bigger sort of buckets and really kind of putting some time, energy, and resource behind those things. We do have a few questions in the chat here that I want to just take a moment to maybe kind of think through. One was how, dyslexia has not been something that public schools have recognized. There has been, I know when I was working in public schools, like that was something no one wanted to talk about, which was really a shame. I think a lot of states are getting a little bit better at recognizing. We, even in the task force conversation for the governor's work, we've been talking about that openly. Like there's no consensus definition on the state level. I know there's one that IDA has published, and I know it's being updated right now, but there's no, like the school districts don't have a guide for what that means. And so if you don't have a guide for what it means, it's easy to kind of pretend it doesn't exist, right? And so, which is also like when we think about the language we use here, we talk about a language-based learning disability very specifically because diagnostically that has some power, that has some meaning. And it also kind of elevates the level of urgency, the level of clarity diagnostically, what you do now that you know you have some of these challenges. And so the question here is like, what are some good test or screeners for dyslexia? I don't know if the two of you want to, share any sort of thoughts about that, because I know there's a few things that that people are publishing right now to kind of help do some screening for that. But there's also a lot of non-dyslexic specific things that I've always used in my work as well.
Yeah, I mean, we in our work have moved. I think we came into this work thinking this is going to be about kind of like finding the undiagnosed dyslexics, the students who need what Windward's providing it and providing it in the school system. We've actually moved a little bit away from that for a variety of reasons, partially because of sort of the red tape of doing that within the public school system, and partially because there are so many students struggling to read who, once you're 3 or 4 years behind and you're 10 years old, it doesn't matter if you are dyslexic or not in terms of the intervention that you need. And so for our work, we've sort of moved away from that and moved more toward using, we don't use this dyslexia diagnosis tool. We use a few sort of quick screening tools, a nonsense word fluency, some of the quick short tests that kind of indicate to us that a child maybe, I think people are more comfortable using at risk for dyslexia now, at least in New York City public schools, but really indicating that child is going to benefit from the program that we're going to provide. So it's really similar to our earlier conversation. It's to us, the important thing is identifying children who we think are going to respond to what we can actually give them, as opposed to the diagnosis. I do believe, though, on a personal level, that there is a tremendous power in having that diagnosis and using that language as you do around having a disability. There's a legal right that comes with that. But as I said earlier, in some of the communities we're serving, I think that's, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that legal right is used for.
Yeah, for good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if we want to address one more question, or we have time?
Yeah.
There's one by Kim Foster here about the importance of pairing instruction and intervention. And I think that one is just one that's really important, is that, we often have our students with the lowest reading ability, and we're asking them to make connections between what they're learning in core instruction and intervention, and to make sense of the different words. And so I think one thing we could think about, and maybe this is what she's thinking about here, is making sure that the language we're using in instruction and intervention is aligned, and the pedagogical practices we're using are aligned, and maybe the content, like we should be working on developing code-based skills with also building knowledge, like developing students' history. And so I think that also relates to another question that had come up. And so I do think, alignment is important. And she's right that there are curriculum that are not evidence-based. And you talked about this earlier, Jamie, that, we're doing a better job now of identifying high-quality instructional materials, which is key.
Yeah. And I so appreciate that work that there's a lot of folks kind of pushing on that, which has been great. So I just want to, again, say thank you to our two panelists here. Every time I'm in a conversation individually or in a group with the two of you, I just leave feeling so full and feel so optimistic of the fact that we've got some really incredible partners out in the community doing some really substantial, meaningful work on behalf of our kids. So I just want to say thank you for everything that you've done, certainly from the SBLA standpoint, and for kids and families in New York City. Ruth, you are a champion, and so is every person on your team. I'm inspired by you all daily. Phil, I just so appreciate your sort of your focus on translating science, putting teachers and kids first at the center of that conversation, thinking about building bridges. And I'm just really happy to have you a little closer to us up here, on the East Coast. I'm sure Texas misses you, but we're glad you're over at Harvard School of Education, and we're really excited to continue to strengthen that partnership. So it means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to Windward. Before we go, we do have a quick, I think, survey we're going to throw in the chat here, I believe, or actually it's going to pop up here. It is, because we love to kind of always fine tune how we get to you and how you find us. So if you would take a moment, throw in here how you heard about us, how you found your way to this. But we would love to be able to kind of just continue to refine our work to make sure we're maximizing our audience. We had over 260 people registered for today's event. And we're just really excited about the scope, the scale, the impact that we have when we get to do these little educational webinars. So big thank you for everybody for joining us, and a big thank you again to our panelists. And I don't want to miss an opportunity to give a big shout out to the WI team. Harry, who's incredible work, makes all the tech side of this go really well, and he tries to make me look good in the process. And so a lot of gratitude to Harry, and certainly Alexis Pokna and the entire WI team. Thank you for everything you've done to make today a wild success. So appreciate it. I love the little emojis floating up there, all the hearts here. That's great. So
thank you so much for having us here tonight.
thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for joining.
Pleasure.
Thanks for being here.